Bob Mueller scored another first, the first former Trump campaign aide to get a jail sentence. Now, this convicted felon's not as high level as Paul Manafort. The sentence not nearly as long as many people could face, but it's another step in the progress of this Mueller probe. Now, what you see is, much to the White House's dismay, neither the complaints in Rudy Giuliani's interviews nor the endless witch hunt tweets are stopping this forward-grinding progress of what Mueller wants and what he's getting. So here's the news. A judge handing down a 2-week jail sentence to the former Trump campaign advisor who set the Russia probe in motion, George Papadopoulos. Now, that's a very light sentence for the crime of lying to the feds, but it's also, in its lightness and its leniency, a validation of the larger Mueller strategy. Defy him and face an endless legal sledgehammer. Paul Manafort, of course, looking at years in jail with up to 2 trials remaining. Or the alternative, cooperate with Mueller, flip and tell, and get a sentence so light you might reasonably forget about it someday. Note that Papadopoulos' sentence is less time than the only other person to have been sentenced in this probe, Dutch lawyer Alex van der Zwaan. He did a full month. Now, in this hearing, which was late today, and that's why we have so much different breaking news right now, George Papadopoulos told the judge he made a terrible mistake and wants to redeem himself. He also publicly argued that he lied to investigators partly because he wanted to distance himself from what he thought was probably an illegal action or dangerous information within the Trump world itself. And Papadopoulos not only flipped, which of course is formalized tonight, he also took another parting shot at his old boss, Donald Trump, on this way into jail. His lawyers arguing Trump himself hindered this investigation more than Papadopoulos ever could.
George was listening to his preferred candidate and his president of the United States opining that this was a witch hunt. But when George went in on January 27th, he was of the mindset this was not as significant as we have now all learned it to be.
That is legalese for a kind of a version of the coffee boy defense. Trump also arguing Papadopoulos not significant.
I see Papadopoulos today. I don't know Papadopoulos. I don't know him. I saw him sitting in one picture at a table with me. That's the only thing I know about him. I don't know him. But they got him on, I guess, a couple of lies is what they're saying. Flynn, where the FBI said he didn't lie, but Mueller's people said he did lie. So I don't want to be set up with a perjury trap.
Now, here is that picture of that table. We'll put it up for you in that meeting in March 2016. Papadopoulos' lawyers also punch back about what happened in that room that you're looking at. They say, quote, while some in the room rebuffed George's offer to meet with Putin, Trump nodded, deferring to Sessions, who appeared to like the idea. Now, Mueller is now effectively done with that defendant, but today he was putting another witness into that intimidating grand jury room. It was a busy day for Mueller. Randy Credico, the political activist and comedian who has links to Julian Assange and Roger Stone, was back in there in the grand jury room testifying. So, of course, it makes you wonder, was Mueller interested in WikiLeaks today, or Roger Stone, or both? Well, we learned the answer. Take a look.
How much of the questioning had to do with Julian Assange?
Very little. No, don't. The majority of the questioning had to do with Roger Stone. Specific questions we're not going to get into.
You saw the lawyer there trying to get Credico not to answer, but that is big news tonight in addition to everything else. Roger Stone was the focus of the questions today in that grand jury room. So let's take it together. Bob Mueller is hunting right now. Trump's lawyers, meanwhile, sending their own mixed signals about whether Donald Trump will ever face Mueller. Rudy Giuliani announced to much fanfare that Trump wouldn't answer any questions about obstruction of justice, even in writing. That made headlines. And then he added later, well, nothing's totally off the table. Now, that is the public message from Trump's lawyer. But remember, the private message, according to Bob Woodward's reporting just this week, is that it's all the opposite, and that Trump himself told one of his own lawyers he didn't want to face Mueller ever. I'm joined now by Maya Wiley, former counsel to the mayor of New York City, who's worked as a civil prosecutor in the Southern District of New York and an MSNBC legal analyst, Christian Farias, a legal columnist at New York Magazine, and Bill Kristol, founder and editor-at-large of the Weekly Standard. Maya, when you look at the Rudy argument there, if everything's on the table potentially, that means Mueller would face Trump in a certain situation. Bob Woodward's reporting undercuts that and would make it seem like this is all posturing. Put that in the context of Bob Mueller sending a Trump aide to jail today.
Well, if first of all, let's just say a broken clock is right twice a day. And the broken clock of Donald Trump has said he's afraid of a perjury trap. That's actually Rudy Giuliani talking point, which is interesting that the president used that today. I think what we have heard from the president is that he is concerned, despite the fact that he has repeatedly expressed his willingness. If I'm Donald Trump, I'm going to listen to my lawyers and I'm not going to talk to Bob Mueller. The reality is it's going to call into question whether or not Mueller's going to then take the step of a grand jury subpoena. I don't think you're going to see that anytime soon because of the midterm elections, obviously. But if you're Donald Trump, you are thinking about the fact that you have made inconsistent statements publicly and repeatedly, and therefore going in and having a conversation with Bob Mueller, very tough to thread that needle in a way that doesn't create a potential perjury charge.
Bill Kristol, what message do you read in the legal strategy of Bob Mueller giving Papadopoulos tonight, effectively just 2 weeks in jail?
I guess they maybe asked for a little more. The judge decided on 2 weeks, but yeah, Light said, well, you should cooperate with Mueller or with the special counsel investigation, with the Justice Department. You shouldn't lie to the FBI, but if you do, you'll be treated better if it's a small lie in the context of cooperation than a big lie. It was interesting that Trump cited Flynn, didn't you think? That's very much on his mind, that speaking of people who are cooperating, Michael Flynn, who knows a lot more than Papadopoulos, I'm going to guess, is continuing to cooperate, I believe, with the special counsel, and hasn't his sentencing been put off 2 or 3 times to continue the cooperation. So the investigation goes on. It looks pretty safe for the next 2 months. I hate to even say that. I don't want to jinx it. From Trump's efforts to fire Mueller, to fire Sessions, to fire Rosenstein, to do God knows what. But you never know, of course, with Trump. I do think on November 6th, November 7th, especially if the Democrats win the House, which I think is likely, I mean, the degree to which things will start happening very quickly can't be, I mean, it's just going to be kind of remarkable. I assume Mueller kind of knows that as a political matter. I wonder how much he's aiming for that November, December window to really start to bring things to a close, wrap it up, and have a report.
Christian?
I'm telling you, the clock is ticking. I don't think, to be a contrarian a little bit, I don't think Mueller is really concerned about the election. Trump is not on the ballot box. Neither are his campaign aides. He's going to keep going with his work. All the hearings that are lined up in the coming days and weeks, the coming trial of Manafort now in talks to possibly work out a plea deal. He's going to keep working. He is not concerned about political considerations because none of the people so far involved in this are up for election. So his work is going to continue unimpeded, and the president is going to continue raging against his work only to his detriment and the detriment of his allies.
I want to reach a little more into the Papadopoulos part, Amaya, which is so new. And if you think back to this, we don't often know this much in real time, but we learned from New York Times reporting it was Papadopoulos who uncorked the entire investigation that began, of course, before there was any notion that Trump would be president, and then, of course, turned into a special counsel probe. Here was his lawyer in court saying, look, he was unsophisticated, quote, naive, a fool. And George Papadopoulos misled investigators to save his professional aspirations and preserve a misguided loyalty to his master. How does that fit in, again, to the choices that other former Trump aides are making here?
Well, I think it fits in to if you try to protect Donald Trump rather than telling the truth, you will only end up not protecting yourself. You can't protect someone if they have actually committed a criminal act or taken steps that makes it appear that they've committed a criminal act, and you're actually going to do much more by coming forward and being honest. And I think what George Papadopoulos and his situation has made clear is tell the truth. And we know from McGahn, right, that McGahn's approach has been to cooperate fully. He obviously is doing that in his own view for a variety of reasons, but that's another indication to the Trump camp. If you are one of those people working for Donald Trump, that's a signal on how you should behave.
I want the panel to stay with me. I mentioned the breaking news, and Control Room tells me we actually have the reporter who broke this story. This is from Bloomberg, Greg Farrell, joining me now on a breaking story that, according to a source that Bloomberg News has spoken with, for the first time confirming the Trump executives face a federal campaign finance probe from the New York Federal prosecutors handling the Cohen case. Greg, this is your story. What did you find?
Hi, Ari. Basically, after Cohen pleaded guilty last month, there was a question as to whether the prosecutors at the Southern District, Rob Khuzami and company, were going to stand down and move on to other things or keep going. And they're keep going. They're going to look and see whether the conduct that Cohen pleaded guilty to, the campaign finance violations, which involved payments approved by several executives at the Trump Organization, if this pattern of conduct was more widespread. In other words, they seem to believe that this didn't just happen on this occasion with Stormy Daniels, but there might have been other campaign finance violations. So that's what they're investigating. It's not clear that they found anything yet, but just that they haven't closed the door on this probe.
What you're saying is significant. It's not prejudging where the probe goes, but it says that Michael Cohen, in the eyes of the New York feds, is the beginning, not the end, of those now campaign violations that he himself pled guilty to. As you know from your reporting, and as many of our viewers have come to understand, the Trump Organization could sound like a big, large thing to many people who watch The Apprentice, but it actually has a very small number of senior executives, which include Trump's family members. Does your reporting shed any light on who would be under scrutiny?
Well, as you pointed out, right, it's not like a huge roster. It's not like General Electric or IBM. There aren't many people, and a lot of them are family members who are there. So, if any of them, if it turns out were involved in any kind of approvals or transactions that were labeled business expenses but turned out to be campaign finance violations, that could be a problem. So clearly the guy in the middle of this is the CFO, Alan Weisselberg, and it's clear that Weisselberg cooperated on the very narrow way in the Cohen plea just around the Stormy Daniels payments and those issues. Now, the question here is whether or not he's going to cooperate, widespread, because he saw or must have approved pretty much every type of expenditure that went out, or not. So that's going to be question one, is to what degree he's going to be helpful, because he literally knows like all the finances and all the payments that got made and approved, et cetera.
Can you rule in or rule out Trump family members?
No, I think it's too early to rule out, because if they were involved, and clearly several of them were involved with the campaign,
right.
Therefore it's quite possible some of them gave a green light, like to pay this way or that way. We don't know that. But,
right, we don't know that, but you're not able to rule them out, and your reasonable inference based on the reporting you've done is that the people who overlap between the Trump Organization and the Trump campaign the most were the family members and Michael Cohen being the person who pled guilty himself to the campaign crime. I want to read from your story and press you a little bit, not on the identity of your source, obviously, as a fellow journalist, I'm not even asking you that, but I will note that your lead says after this conviction of Michael Cohen, you have a person familiar with the matter telling you federal prosecutors in Manhattan are investigating this. Does that mean this entire story in your reporting rests on a single source?
I'm not going to go beyond that. So, that gets a little too close to, that's what we're saying. But, we don't just go out with stuff unless we have an extremely high degree of confidence. So I'll leave that at that.
Are you saying that there is something beyond a single person that gives you that confidence?
Not saying anything. I'll just leave it at that.
Well, when you say not saying anything, I mean, that's several words right there. Technically, you are saying words, Greg. It's my job to press you. I understand what I think you're trying to convey, which is that you stand behind the story. It's a big story. Before I let you go, anything else that you would want to get to that we didn't?
No, except there's a lot of news coming out tonight. We have a great story on Manafort as well, over and above George Papadopoulos, which you were just talking about. There's a few other, scoops we've got here. One on, talks in Manafort's case of maybe a deal. So anyway.
I'm sorry, Greg, you're reporting new information about a potential plea by Paul Manafort?
That's out on Bloomberg now, so we should check that out as well. Not me, my colleagues.
Your colleagues. What can you tell us about that? It's Friday night.
I haven't even gotten into it yet. I've just finished my story.
It's one of those nights. I think we'll stay on all of them. Greg Farrell, thanks for jumping on the phone. Before I go, Maya, your reaction.
My reaction is that this is both meaningful, not surprising. It would be more surprising to me if the Southern District of New York did not follow up on indications that there were ways in which the Trump organization worked. As we know from Michael Cohen, that suggests that there may be a lot of improprieties here in how the financing worked. I also think that it suggests that this source is not someone from within the Southern District of New York, but is someone who might be within the Trump organization. We should remember that Weisselberg did not cooperate. That's the wrong word legally. What he did was he no longer had the ability to assert the Fifth Amendment right not to incriminate himself because they said, we won't come after you for what you say to us on this point, so that he had to come and testify.
Right, which is an important distinction.
It's a big distinction.
We're over on time, given all the breaking news, but Bill Kristol, a final thought from you on how this all plays out. If Donald Trump, given the week he's had, is learning, as he does reportedly learn things through television, that there's this investigation into his organization, which includes, of course, his family as officers, as well as a single source report from Bloomberg, again, reigniting speculation that Mr. Manafort himself could plea.
I mean, it looks like the investigation is pulling on many threads, and a lot of them are proving fruitful, or at least are leading to further things, which is how successful investigations work. It's how Watergate worked, to go back to the one that everyone thinks of, but it's how generally good investigations work. The Cohen thread, the Manafort thread, the Flynn-Papadopoulos thread, if that's kind of one thread, you might say. And I think if I were Donald Trump, I would be very worried and unhappy, and he's got to face the question, does he have the nerve to fire people? Does he have the nerve to pardon people?
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.